Do you go to the gym because you don't want to be a loser? But then you're stuck with bad gun carrying options. Like a loser? What is this? A gun girdle? A waist purse? And don't even get me started with the stupidly slow draw times. There must be another way. And now there is with Arrowhead Tactical Apparel. Yeah! Introducing the way to carry in gym shorts with your regular concealed carry setup. From small guns to full-size guns, the internal belt allows you to wear athletic clothing for an athletic gun. With Arrowhead Tactical Apparel, you could do all the athletic things that you couldn't comfortably do before, like tie your shoes, run with the dogs, rescue an idiot from the bottom of a well.
What's up, girl? What's going on? What's going on? Is Chavez stuck in the well? Wait a minute, what? What are you saying? Cletus got the fit? Cletus got the fit? Where? Where?
Assist your peers through personal development, and much more. This is perfect for anyone who likes wearing athletic clothes who knows how annoying and unsafe it is to carry with an elastic waistband. And guess what? There's
options.
There's shorts. And if you're weird and don't like shorts, there's joggers. Or joggers, but more. You can even get yourself set up with something sweet like a hoodie or a shirt. They even make their own holsters. There's lots of styles to choose from, with options for both men and women, so everyone can be comfortably prepared.
But wait, there's more!
Use code REGULARGUY to save on anything in their store. I hear they do some cool sales every once in a while too. Remember to tell them I sent you, because if you want to dress and carry comfy too, Arrowhead Tactical Apparel is for you. Alright, so I want to be really concise and fairly brief and rather definitive during especially the first portion of this, because I'm trying to be as understanding as possible to the following two folks. A, the guy that's brand new and for once wants a definitive answer on whether or not the thing he's looking at is good. Or B, the guy that has an enormous amount of experience that just realized exactly how huge the Owl Vision game actually can be, and just wants to know if the thing he's looking at is good enough to just click on and throw into a cart. And this is understandable, because generally speaking, if you look up a review on something, it's typically put together by somebody that either A, is really bad at making reviews, or two, someone that does know what they're talking about, just doing as much as possible to make this as confusing as possible for the brand new person. When in fact, there is just a whole lot of stuff that really doesn't matter all that much, especially to a brand new guy. And the way that I like to look at it is like this. When someone's picking up an AR for the first time, right? A lot of times they start trying to do their own research, and let's just say they land on BCM's website. And this is a question that I get quite often, where a guy is essentially just kind of going, hey, I figured that to be as flexible as possible, I'm just going to try and go with a 14.5 mid-length. Okay, great. And also because I learned a little bit about barrel profiles and stuff, I figure that a government profile is more or less middle of the road between pencil and a heavy profile barrel, so I figure that middle of the road performance will get me where I need to be. But then I have a question. And the question is, I hear a lot about cold hammer forged versus not cold hammer forged, and this coating versus that coating. What do you think is the answer here as far as what I need to get? And realistically speaking, the answer is none of that actually matters. You can pick up any one of those things, it'll do exactly what you need it to do, and frankly, the only time that this turns itself back into a question as far as what you should get for you based off of things that you need is only going to come after you've developed enough experience to inform your decision making. Now, this is the reasonable answer to this question, because if you're new to AR stuff, that is not going to matter to you. But then, of course, you have the people that are getting ready to type a huge response to even just that with a whole bunch of nonsense that muddies the water and makes things incredibly annoying for whoever it is that's trying to just pick up a thing that works and will do the job for them. And then, of course, these same people will also try and muddy the water even more by talking about why a 14.5 mid-length is bad for what this guy decided he was going to try and do. This is essentially the Owl Vision game. A very long list of things that can be incredibly complicated if you allow it to be, that really boils down to a fairly short list of things that you should look at to more or less gauge whether or not you should hit the add to cart button. And the rest of this is only really stuff that you can really pay attention to once it's directly in front of your face, and even then, most of the time the little differences that people try and say they notice are things that they'll never actually notice in the first place. So to those two people that I'm trying to pay attention to in the first place, this is the stuff that you pay attention to right here, right now, because there's some nerd stuff that's going to follow this, but this is the really important part. What exactly am I reviewing here? What I'm reviewing is from Steele Industries. This is a Gen 3 white phosphor thin-filmed Elbit tube that has an auto gate function, manual gain control, manual focus and diopter adjustment, manual mill standard turnstile on-off and IR controls, and takes a AA battery. Now this is relevant to you, and there's a reason why you should most likely pick this up. And of course the question following this is why Elbit, why thin film? I hear all this stuff about L3. Gotcha. But the reason why this is a solid roll of the dice for you is A, this is the most common tube that's just on the loose in the market, and it's the most common tube that's currently fielded by a mill contract and everything else. So the standards for military units and whatnot are going to make this a solid roll of the dice, at least as far as the Elbit tubes are concerned. What's also important about this is because it's an Elbit thin film tube, it's going to be considerably cheaper than something from an L3. Now I recognize that L3 is essentially synonymous with high performance and that sort of thing. But for reasons that we're going to get into in greater depth here, the difference between an L3 filmless tube and a thin film tube by Elbit is really not all that much, and after a certain point you get serious diminishing returns for the dollar amount that's spent. So what this is going to do is it's going to save you a considerable amount of money, and the thin film is going to help protect the photocathode to the point where if you have to stare in the direction of light sources and things like that, there is no difference between being in the vicinity of or centered up on a light source. If it's anywhere in the tube, you're looking right at it. So as far as the intensifier is concerned, the longer exposure that you have to this sort of stuff, the more possible damage that you could do if you center up on that object for really long periods of time. The thin film essentially adds protection to that photocathode, with the consequence being you lose a little bit of the quality of image that you can perceive in front of your face. But the cool thing about this as well is that if you're getting something that's a little bit cheaper, that has the minimum performance that you would need for basically anything that you could possibly run into, it allows you to make all of your mistakes with a unit that's tough enough to perform with other high-end ones and still do quite well. Now the next question is, why Steele Industries? Look, it just comes down to this. They have a good rep, they have solid QC practices, and they have a solid warranty method, which, considering how expensive a lot of this stuff is, you really do want that in case you got a unit that was made on Monday morning. Now of course the next question that I can go ahead and answer here is, how did my individual unit perform over the last 3 years that I've had it? Well, this isn't just a teaching arena that I've entered in with it, where I'm teaching either a fundamentals class on how to work well in the dark, or a small unit tactics class that require a lot of movement, communicating, planning, and things like that before you start to execute on whatever it is that you're trying to do. But in addition to this, I'm also taking this into the tree line with unit functions, as I am still doing the Army thing with a reconnaissance platoon within a combat engineer unit. So over the last 3 years, I'm averaging roughly 1,000+ hours behind this particular set of owl vision, and throughout the 3 years, it's functioned exactly like a military unit should. No more, no less, perfectly middle of the road as far as performance goes. I've had zero issues in rain, sleet, snow, mud, fog. I've kept the thing on night after night for days straight, so anytime that I'm not using it, it's because the sun's up, and the second the sun goes back down, it comes back on. So there was no issues as far as having to use it in a pretty high tempo environment. I've never had to send it back for repair or anything like that, so it performed exactly the way that it should. And as far as very, very low ambient light levels, as well as light polluted levels, it handles itself in a way that you would expect from a military unit. So realistically speaking, if all you wanted was a seal of approval to be like, ah, great, add to cart, and just kind of go from there, this is it. Because if, for instance, you're looking at the Steele Industries website right now, any one of those options that's listed right there, if you were to just touch one of those, you'd be in pretty good shape if you're brand new, and if you got a ton of experience, whichever one that you look at there, without knowing anything about the numbers, is going to do the job that you need it to do. It'll serve whatever purpose you need it to serve, and you're not going to feel severely undergunned when some guy shows up with his L3, whatever it is. Because fact is, this is essentially middle of the road type stuff. It's going to really shred the Gen 2 stuff, and while the Gen 2 Plus stuff from like Photonus, as a for instance, has really closed the gap, it's still going to perform better than those, because as dark time stuff is concerned, the thin film Elbit tubes are essentially the last rung in performance to dollars spent ratio, in which, okay, I'm spending X amount of money, I should expect Y amount of performance that's proportionate to the dollar value that I'm spending. So as a for instance, this is going to shred the Gen 2 stuff. Great, the Gen 2 Plus stuff from Photonus is pretty alright, and in fact it's usable, but the extra $400-ish that you'd spend on a Gen 3 unit that's using an Elbit tube that's thin filmed and all that stuff is going to be just a little bit better than that Gen 2 Photonus tube stuff that is being put together by, for instance, the same company, because Steele does both. And then immediately after this, the dollar amount that is spent is just not proportional whatsoever. You actually get increasingly more diminishing returns the more expensive this gets. So it's good enough to be functional regardless of the experience level, because I'd argue the really crummy stuff requires a ton of experience to use remotely well, but it's also not going to fall behind the air quotes really high-end units that, again, could be assembled by Steele themselves. They're just using higher quality tubes from L3, as a for instance. So if that's all you needed as far as, okay, got it, cool, I'm gonna go do the thing now, great. But what I would suggest is for you to stick around for a lot of the nerd stuff as to why I've come to this conclusion, and why a lot of other guys are going to as well. Mostly because A, the better informed you are, the better you are overall, and 2, I work pretty hard on these, so it'd be cool if we watch the rest of it. Today's video is sponsored by the Sonoran Desert Institute. Have you ever thought about making a living in the firearms industry? If you enjoy gun repair, ballistics, learning about firearms, the Sonoran Desert Institute might just be a good fit for you. To find out more about SDI, visit sdi.edu. Use the link in the description down below, or call 480-999-4767 today. And now back to the video. So before we talk nerd terms and nerd numbers and things like that, I need to make my position on this thoroughly clear. I recognize that there are a lot of folks that are going to do everything that they can to push high performance numbers on you just to get you to spend a greater dollar amount on a lot of different things. I'm not necessarily in that camp, because look, if you have the disposable income to get the highest end stuff available, more power to you, because the little advantages do actually stack and they do actually perform better. That said, even if all this stuff stacks together, it's not going to be leaps and bounds, and especially many thousands of dollars more expensive than somebody that decided to use a unit like this, as a for instance. However, there's the equally ridiculous other side of the house that tries to do everything in its power to knock how important it is to actually see well in the dark, by saying utterly ridiculous things like, I might as well just use a flashlight, or you don't see that much better in the dark anyway, or why would I buy from some company when I can assemble a unit in my garage and we're good to go there? Both sides of the house are pretty ridiculous in their own right, but frankly much more so than like the anti-modernity guys that are just kind of like, oh, I don't need all that extra stuff, it's really dumb, blah blah blah, because failure to modernize is how you lose, number one, and number two, from a philosophical standpoint, I believe that the average person should budget and actually be well versed in the dark, regardless of what walk of life that you lead. Simply because if 2A stuff was to be used in the way that 2A is intended, you essentially want to be so good at doing things when it's dark that you force most things to happen during the day, because to venture into the dark would be incredibly, and I mean impossibly, dangerous. So that's where I stand on that, but I also understand that in order to get into this arena, it needs to be affordable in the first place, especially if you're disciplined enough to properly budget. And it should also not be so so expensive as to put off your ability to learn these things, which means we more or less have to figure out an entry point that is actually useful to us. So that's more or less where I stand on this, and this is more or less how I've developed a bunch of my opinions based off of what I've personally seen. Now, as far as what I've personally seen, it's been quite a lot over the last decade and a half. I've used a lot of really high-end stuff, and I've also used a lot of damaged really high-end stuff. And what I mean by that is military units go through like 50 plus dudes, and even if it's a pretty good unit in and of itself, it doesn't really matter all that much if it looks like there's a friggin' gravel road in front of your face. In addition to this, I've also used some really trash house level stuff that requires an enormous amount of experience to remotely use well. I developed my opinions over time between a monocular and a binocular system, and with many thousands of hours of use, but not just like the shooting stuff either. I mean, the experiences on this are incredibly varied, from super mundane tasks like guarding featureless desert, or having to do a bunch of manual labor driving for endless hours, or very active things like having to do the shoot, move, communicate part with lots of people, lots of IR light and laser in the air, that sort of stuff, in combination with vehicles moving all over the place, IR strobes going, and a lot of varied weather patterns. As previously stated, rain, sleet, snow, fog, really muddy environments, really light polluted environments that were both via moonlight and stars, or in suburban areas that have a lot of incandescent or LED lights, or a mix between the two, to urban environments where a lot of times light saturates a lot of the area that you're in, but there's enough dark spots to where you have to use the owl vision to see into those dark spots in the first place, which means you're constantly switching between up and down, naked eye, non-naked eye. So at this point, I think I've developed a pretty solid basis for my opinions on these things. So if you're looking to learn a little bit more other than, hey, just go here and click this thing, let's talk about the data sheet that you're gonna get, and a lot of times what's listed on like a reputable website that says, hey, we have these units that are available, here's the major numbers on the spec sheet, let's talk about what those mean. So it's important to note that all of the numbers that are on the data sheet that you receive once your individual unit is in your hands actually do matter. These numbers do have a sum of total parts equation, and that's the unit that you have in your hand. However, although each one contributes to a whole, sometimes each individual metric contributes in a really small way, to the point where if you hyperfixate on a particular set of digits, whether or not they're in the range that you want them doesn't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things, because typically speaking, these units are put together with a particular range of specs in mind. Because the reality of the matter is that there's no commercial or military bin or spec or production line. They're all made the same. The main difference between what goes in a military contract bin and a commercial bin usually has to do with the end result of the manufacturing process, because while that is the same across the board, you're going to have a lot of different variability in your end product per individual unit. So what this means is not each unit is individually the same as another. Each one is special in their own right and will have slightly different stats regardless to how consistent the manufacturing process is at present. So usually what separates a mill contract go and a commercial sale is, for some reason or another, there's a spec or two or whatever that is slightly below a mill contract spec, and that's what determines the different classifications between the two as far as what's being sold where. Fun fact though, sometimes orders do just need to go out. So what is traditionally about to get slated for commercial sale because of one or two stats that didn't quite meet the mill contract spec is going to get sent with the mill contract anyway, because a lot of people acknowledge that an individual set of stats that are slightly lower here and there does not a bad unit make. So a lot of times when we look at commercial units that are being sold to guys via a website as lesser, and typically speaking, even if this technically doesn't meet a mill standard or mill spec for a particular data sheet that's available on that particular unit based off of their findings, this doesn't necessarily mean that it is a bad or a lesser unit. And a lot of times if you compare off the same line, the one that went to that military unit someplace or your living room, a lot of times if you drop them right in front of each other and just have a look, you really can't tell the difference between the two really at all. That said though, because we're not issued to things and because we're individually purchasing purchasing them, there are some stats that you want to look out for, and provided that all of these things cost the same, which a lot of times if you have a big list of options, they're listed at the same price anyway, which is a really big indicator that from spec set to spec set, they're not that different in the first place because they cost the same. Still though, if we want to take a look at what's on an individual spec sheet, if we can get certain things that are a little bit higher based on some desirable traits that we're going to look for, all the better. So let's talk about, at least in my eyes, and I'm not the only one that thinks this too, the most important stat that will be on that sheet and what's often listed on websites as well, and that would be the signal to noise ratio. What this more has to deal with is the low light performance of that individual unit. So as ambient light starts to go away for whatever reason, and as an environment starts to get truly dark, like to the point where even really high performing tubes start to struggle a little bit, you'll start to notice at one level or another, essentially these little grains of sand, or what look a little bit like snow or static, not really like falling snow, but like little static, little particulates and that sort of stuff that start popping in and out at random intervals and speeds while the unit is on. What this is referred to as noise. So how high your signal is versus your noise is what's highly valued here, because as the ambient light starts to go away, the higher your signal is and the less noise that you have, the more clear the image is and the easier it is for you to determine what you can see and what you can't. Because at the end of the day, image quality and contrast are the only things that matter, especially in really low light conditions or light polluted conditions. So as far as bare minimum, meaning this will in fact work, this is worth hitting add to cart over, bare minimum, at least in my eyes, based off of what I've seen from a number of different units, is if your SNR is at about 27 and higher, you're in good shape. Now, the averages that I see from units that are on sale on websites, right? And I keep saying on websites because this is also something that should be noted. If it's on Steele Industries, their website, or if it's on, for instance, TNVC, typically speaking, these guys are getting high quality units with higher spec sheets. And by contrast to this, the same Steele Industries type of unit that's being sold, for instance, at Optics Planet, when you compare the one at Optics Planet, for instance, to the one that's on Steele Industries website or on TNVC, the spec sheet on the Steele Industries website or the TNVC website is going to be, on average, better across the board. So this is a rather important distinction to make because, well, it's a rather clever way to get you to go to their website to buy direct from them rather than using a third-party website that's selling their stuff. This makes sense to me. Now, obviously, I used the word on average, but typically speaking, if you look at one versus the other, it's like, oh, clearly the stuff on their website's better. It's not hard to figure out. But for instance, on average with a thin film Gen 3 white floss, right, your averages tend to be between 27 and high 31 to 32-ish, somewhere in that range. From 27 to 32, this is all good. This is all stuff that you can use. This is all stuff that you can get lots of work done. So if you're looking at one that's at 27, this isn't like a, oh, okay, so I guess this works, but I'll barely scrape by. No, you're fine if you see 27 on the spec sheet. That said, obviously though, if you can go a little bit higher, or if you can go proportionally dramatically higher, up to 31, 30, 32, something like that, this is obviously better. But if, for instance, you're sitting at a 29, your experience is not going to be hurt by that number at all. So that covers the really low light performance. Now let's talk about light polluted performance. And what kind of sucks about this is that the modulation transfer function is the individual unit's ability to more or less render contrast between an object that you're looking at separate from the background. What sucks, and the reason why I say it sucks, is because this isn't a stat that's actually listed on the datasheet itself. And what's even worse is that this is actually the determining factor, especially in light polluted environments. That said though, there's other stats that you can look at that are not necessarily perfect indicators of this, but are pretty good tells as to what type of light polluted performance that you're going to have. And oddly enough, what this turns into for me is the first thing that I would look at that actually has nothing to do at all with ambient light, and that would be halo. Now, halo is present whether or not you're in a light polluted environment or a really low ambient light environment. But it's also a good indicator as to how the unit's going to perform in a light polluted environment, because what this is more or less a little light photon bubble that forms around individual lights that you can see. Whether it's a tiny Christmas tree light or a car's headlight, there's going to be projected around it some sort of little light halo. Now, how bad that is and how hard it obscures your ability to see stuff behind that light is more or less determined by the numbers that you can see on the sheet, and then of course once you have it in front of your face. But typically speaking, as far as this is concerned, when you're looking at numbers, lower is better as far as the stat sheet is concerned. So a bare minimum operating number that I would consider being totally fine for regular use, meaning if you're here and below you're in excellent shape, would be essentially 1.25 max, not minimum, maximum, and lower than that. Now, the minimum rating is typically not listed on websites and that sort of thing, but if it is, hooray, great. It lets you know what your halo effect is going to be at much greater distances or with lower powered lights, or a combination of those things. But the max is what's most important to look at here, and that's typically what's listed on websites to start, or exclusively. And the reason for this is rather obvious. When the light is more intense, you need to know how badly it's going to mess with your ability to see other things than that light. So if your max is at 125 and lower, this is essentially like my operating minimum, because if it's much more than that, it starts to get really difficult to see other things behind that light halo. So 125 and lower is typically where I want to be on that, and a lot of times I forget the unit that I have was made a little over 3 years ago. So if you were to go onto TNVC or Steele Industries, as for instance, the halo that you're likely to see listed on these websites is probably, proportionally speaking, significantly lower, usually somewhere below 1 if we're talking, again, a thin film Elbit tube. But either way, less is better in this regard. Resolution, more or less, should be obvious, but the methods for determining it are less so. Now, this essentially equates to the quality of the image, right? So the modulation transfer function helps with contrast, and resolution helps with the quality of the overall image. Now, how this is determined is honestly a little sketch, but there isn't many other ways that you can perform this, because this more or less requires a lab test in which a standardized line pair test is conducted with an individual observer. Now, when you heard individual observer, you heard a person, that guy's eyes, whoever that guy is. And yeah, that's how it's performed. Rolling the dice makes a little bit more sense if we're talking about companies that are established and have been doing this for quite some time, because their process for this is likely pretty good. Now, there's more to this, obviously, but I'm going to keep it as simple as possible and stick now to the numbers that you'll end up seeing on the data sheet. So the numbers that you'll see on a data sheet won't step by step graduate to where there isn't like a 64, 65, 66, 67. You'll more or less get different types in that there's a 64, and then there's line of 68, 72, stuff like that. But here's the thing about resolution, and a lot of times, especially guys that play video games, will see resolution and be like, I need to have the highest number that I could possibly get. And the thing is, and especially if you play video games, I thoroughly understand automatically assuming that if it's at 64, it's not that great, but if I go to like 82, to where if I'm at 64, that's like okay, but if I go to 72 or even 81, that's incredible, right? That the difference must be staggering. The problem with that, and the problem with equating that more or less to gaming and stuff, is that, yeah, this makes a lot of sense when we're talking about gaming and that sort of thing, because a lot of times your resolution, as far as really high performance machines is concerned, is also usually tied up to like really high frame rates as well. So if it looks really pretty, and if the frames are really good, oh my god, this is incredible. The thing is, though, is that you always get the same amount of frames. So your ability to perceive higher resolution is incredibly limited. So if I were to match up a 64 LP, and what I mean by LP is like lines per resolution, to a 72, typically speaking, if I didn't tell you what it was and then just had you look at one tube and then the other, you really wouldn't be able to tell much of a difference, especially seeing as that doesn't directly directly tie itself to other settings. So you can have a really low SNR, but a really high resolution. And while that isn't really as common to have like a really high resolution, but like a crappy signal to noise ratio, you do see that sometimes. So you more or less want to mate up a certain standard, and then the number one thing that you want to pay attention to more than anything else is the SNR, really. So here's to deal with this, right? As far as minimum numbers for resolution that you want to look at and go no lower is 64. Now, as far as averages go, and especially with thin film Elbit tubes is concerned, I don't think I've ever seen lower than 64, and I'm certain someone somewhere has seen lower than 64 before, but there's a reason why that's more or less the standard is, okay, we can see good here, and even if the resolution goes up, we can't really tell that much of a difference, right? So 64 is pretty much where you want to start, and I'm not going anywhere else, right? So while it is a very important number, this is essentially, it's a, okay, minimum 64 or greater, great. This isn't really a thing that codes itself into your brain to really hunt for, because it's really easy to remember that number as the base level minimum, and if I get more, great. I'm just probably not going to be able to notice it all that much, to be honest. So now let's talk about less important numbers. And some of you have been freaking out at me the whole time because I'm oversimplifying tons of things. The reality of the matter is, yeah, you can make this really, really complicated, but once you start really breaking it down, what you have to actually scout for basically ended right there. But there's lots of things that people lose their mind over, so let's talk about FOM. Now, FOM is a figure of merit. All it really is your signal to noise multiplied by your resolution. If you've been paying attention at all, there's absolutely a reason why FOM is not all that important. Because you can have really good signal to noise with lower resolution, have a really high performing tube for the most part, or as far as any other standard would really suggest, because even if the total stat sheet is fairly low, a really high signal to noise with a 64 resolution is gonna work out for you just fine, as a for instance. But overall, the FOM is kind of low when you compare it to other units. Now, a lot of people lost their mind over FOM for quite some time, but a lot of times this can be also influenced by other units that have, for instance, really high resolution, but when compared to a lot of other units, they kind of have like a crappy SNR. So I'll say this about FOM. The figure of merit is not a definitive number to look at, but at the very least, it is a minimum indicator. So for instance, if I see a FOM that's in the high 1800s, I can more or less assume most likely the resolution is around about 64, and now I gotta look at the SNR. If I'm looking at a FOM that's roughly in the 2000s, okay, one of these two numbers is boosted a little bit because it's just one multiplied into the other. So again, this isn't a definitive, hey, must be good because the FOM is really high. It's an indicator of a couple of factors, and now you have to go look at the two major numbers that are going to influence a lot of your decisions. And then of course, once you're done with those, really check out that halo and make sure that's within that operating number that we talked about previously. A lot of people get really passionate, and I mean really passionate about photocathode sensitivity. Like, some people get rather out of control about this. And the case that's made is that it directly contributes to a really high SNR. But the fact is that just because your photocathode sensitivity is really high, it's not a one-to-one relationship. It could indicate a high SNR, but they're not directly linked in that way. And also, there are different factors that could drive your SNR down or up and that sort of thing. So again, it's not a direct one-to-one type relationship there. And in reality, your signal to noise ratio is what you really need to look at anyhow, so I'm just gonna kind of sidestep away from that. The EBI references the glow that you could experience in really dark, I mean black environments where you really cannot see things. And the reason why some people make this a big deal is because the glow that's coming off of what you can see out of the optic itself can interfere with your ability to see really anything at all under these uncommon low light type events. And the reason why I don't care about this really at all is, well, if it's that dark, I can't see anyway. So if there's slightly more glow, oh well. And the reason why one isn't going to be totally out of control compared to another as far as unit to unit metrics are concerned is, again, regardless to what ends up a commercial or mill contract unit, the variability between one and the other is really not going to be all that great to begin with. And it only really starts to turn itself into a really big issue if it's at night and you're you're in a really hot environment. So if you're in the tropics, in which the temperature hardly likes to change at all until the sun comes out, and then it's just a sauna everywhere and it's extra hot because there's a nuclear bomb over your head, or when you're in the high desert and it goes from 135 degrees to 10 o'clock in the evening or 2 o'clock in the morning and it's still 97, because whether or not you are shivering right now from that temperature change, it's still 97 friggin' degrees outside. Again, unless you are in uncommonly pitch black environments to where, regardless to what you put this in, the tube is gonna have a real hard time seeing anything in the first place. I mean, just based off of what I just described, right? It's not something to care about, really. Like, just being straight, I don't even look at EBI, and I've never been hindered because of it. So, shop smart, EBI is not gonna be out of control, you're fine. Little cosmetic things, too, man. Good God. Like, okay, as a for instance, you're gonna hear a lot of people looking at or taking pictures of, like, spots or imperfections in what they can see based off of a white background and the tube that's on. I'm just gonna put it like this. Unless there is an entire dime in front of your face, spots are a non-concern. If you magnify enough, you're going to find imperfections anyway, and the real world is full of dark spots. You're good. You're never going to notice it in practice. It's not something to focus on in general, and unless you're a manufacturer that's trying to be like, hey, this is what it looks like, you have no reason to be taking these photos in the first place. Let it be, leave it alone. That said, in summary to all this, I just went through a lot of stuff, like a lot of stuff, that can aid you a little bit in getting a slightly better spec on a tube that's available on a website someplace, right? But the realistic thing behind all of this is that if, for instance, you look for exactly what the title says in this video, and that's a Gen 3 thin film Elbit tube, and you go to Steele Industries, the website, or you go to TNVC and look at the same stuff, you could blindly click on any of those things and you'll end up with a white phosphor tube that works perfectly fine. That's the big thing to really take away from this whole thing. Yes, there are certain things that all add up and they all matter, and you could use that to leverage slightly better stats out of an available option list as previously stated, but man, like, people get really dumb about a lot of things, and in reality, it would be like anything else that you could nuance into the ground. And what's really hard on the tism of some of these folks is the simple fact that no two units are exactly the same. So of course people lose their minds over things that really don't matter all that much. But if it made enough sense at this point, you could more or less just kind of safe bet in places like this. And unless your unit was assembled on a Monday morning or a Friday evening, what you're gonna get is fine. You can more or less just sort of section this. L3 filmless, really high performance stuff, turbo expensive. Thin film Elbit tubes, middle of the road, basically the last time that you start to spend money in this arena that has equal merit to performance. Gen 2 Plus, mostly fine, but usually around about $400 cheaper than an Elbit tube in the first place, which just outperforms it. I'm gonna spend the $400. And then regular Gen 2, which is just not great at all. Really easy more or less to figure out, and I hope this sort of just came full circle from not very complicated at all to all the numbers and stuff that sort of suck to look at because this gets needlessly complicated and people get into internet fistfights for no reason, and then right back to really simple again. But in any case, whatever you were here for, either the simple explanation or the nerd stuff or all of it, if you got this far, I really do appreciate the fact that you took the time out of your day to come here and watch me rant about all this stuff. But look, none of this matters if you don't train. So if you'd like to train with us, you absolutely can do that. I have open enrollment classes that are on the website through December. You can also set up a private class with me. All you have to do is contact us. We're really easy to contact because our website is in the description below. In addition to this, if you want to check us out on Patreon and support us through there, it's massively appreciated. And if you want something out of that, $41 a month gets you as much open enrollment training as you could possibly want, unless it's something logistically challenging, like a soft skin vehicle class. And if you want to set up a private class, to $41 a month doesn't cover that either, for rather obvious reasons. Also, if you want to check us out through Facebook, Instagram, Discord, all that, links for all of this are in the description below. And look, if and only if this was helpful, and if you enjoyed the video, give us a like, a subscribe, hit the bell, which is the real subscribe button. And remember, guys, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Easy.